This is the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast, hosted by Jo Youle. Each new moon, we'll explore with our guests how to think globally and act locally with ecofeminism. Awaken all your senses. The spirit of the witches comes to your ears. The Sabbath is that way. Gang of Witches.
Welcome back to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast. And today we're exploring the idea that for our species to have a future, it must be local. The words of today's guest in the introduction chapter of her book, Local is Our Future. And after seeing her make a passionate speech a few weeks ago about our need to have fresh, healthy, locally produced, but also affordable food, and the fact that it's essentially a fundamental human right, I think you'll agree she has a very big point. Helena Norberg-Hodge continues to explain that produce from just a mile away costs twice that of the processed dead, irradiated food from 10,000 miles away that's usually flown in and sold to our local supermarkets. So when I saw this clip on Instagram on the Local Futures page, I began to ask myself, why could that be? Because when you look at it, it's actually true, especially here on Ibiza. And only 2 episodes ago, we chatted to 3 female farmers about why only 2% of the food eaten on the island is actually made here. And we heard how that fact breaks the hearts of these rural women who work so hard to make this produce full of goodness for us. And when you dig a little bit deeper, it should actually break our hearts too, because it's a symbol of our reality and what Helena describes as the injustice and manipulation of the global economy. And once you get your head around that and what it really means, the good news is it is actually something that can be quite easily changed. And right now, it's already happening. So there is hope. And amongst the story of globalisation versus localisation, we'll be diving headlong into what we can do to change this narrative and agenda so that we all have access to fresh, local produce at a reasonable price. Because at some stage, we've all experienced the kind of pummeling away of our positivity about this story. We're bombarded with advertising and the simple hammering home of this idea that it's easier, quicker, cheaper, and more convenient to whiz into the local supermarket and grab everything we need that's travelled thousands of kilometres to reach us. Clearly, on an island, this has far-reaching implications, as so much of the produce we consume here is imported. But looking at the way things are now in terms of the local shops, the high streets, local businesses and communities in tatters after COVID, because they've all lost their trade and their ability to stay afloat. So this conversation has never been more important to be having, and that supporting local is the way forward. So it's with great pleasure that I'm joined live on the line all the way from Australia by the director and founder of Local Futures, pioneer of the local economy or new economy movement, and recipient of the Alternative Nobel Prize, Helena Norberg-Hodge. Helena, welcome to the Gang of Witches Ibiza podcast.
Very happy to be here.
Thank you so much for making the time to join us today. And I've got to be honest, I found you through what seems to be your sort of Ibiza fan club. Many of the women we've been speaking to on the podcast have already been with us as well. And they all know you personally and very kindly loaned me a copy of your book. So I'm really grateful that you've made time for us to have this conversation today, because I gather that you have quite strong connections to Ibiza and you've spent quite a bit of time here.
Yes, I did. And I do feel a deep affection for the people there and for the island. As everyone knows, it's so beautiful, but it's one of those places that's drawn in people with my values, people who love nature and who really care about community. And they're generally very sophisticated people who have tasted the emptiness of the consumer culture, the emptiness of the sort of career ladder, and are looking for more meaning. So I love it and have lots of good friends there.
So I want to come back to the Ibiza story a little bit later on, but if we could kind of start at the beginning, because this journey with localization, or the realization of the benefits of it for human, societal and ecological well-being, started around 1975 when you were in Ladakh or Little Tibet. For those who haven't read Ancient Futures, your first book, maybe you could just give us a little overview of what exactly it was that you witnessed living there and immersing fully in that culture.
I guess I'm becoming aware more and more with the years of how rare it was what I encountered, that most cultures that we think of as traditional or indigenous were affected already by Christianity, even 1,000 years ago. And people changed their names and it had a very, very negative effect. And this little corner of Tibet, West Tibet, which is what Ladakh is, even escaped that influence of Christianity. There were missionaries there, but they didn't pervert the culture. They managed to convert a few orphans. And then later on with colonialism, same thing. It was too remote. And so they weren't really interested in Ladakh either as, for production or any kind of a market. And then in the modern era with development, again, it was cut off actually for political reasons. So I arrived in 1975 in a place that really had been remarkably unaffected by what I see as a disastrously destructive global economic system that started with those historical roots in Christianity, which of course included the burning of the witches, included destroying those women who had knowledge about nature and the power of nature. And later on, it meant genocide, slavery, and a system was set up that benefited global traders to the detriment of virtually everybody else. And that system has continued to escalate, and it has become so vast and so big that most people have not really been looking at it as a system. And Ladakh enabled me, or almost forced me, to stand outside of that system, because that's what this region was. It was outside the influence, the only place in the world I had been where no one had heard of the Beatles and where people were still proud of their own culture, of themselves. And it was a pride that was so incredibly attractive, because the self-respect was so deep that no one needed to sort of boost themselves to show you how important they were or how clever they were. There was just this incredible, natural, easygoing self-acceptance that translated into also this tolerance and openness to others, and a joie de vivre that I had never experienced anywhere. So I just fell in love with the people and the place, and then I witnessed the machinations and the mechanisms of this globalizing economy. And when I started seeing things like butter coming in over the Himalayan mountains, having been transported for a week, and then selling for half the price of butter that was produced, a 2-minute walk away from the market in the central town, and this butter costing half the price, I suddenly started seeing that this idea of efficiency is a myth. It always has been a myth. And I started studying the impact of this global economy, particularly in terms of food and farming, but also on motherhood, on intergenerational relationships, on everything that we care about. And I hope that we will see a growth in interest in learning from indigenous culture and reassessing the entire trajectory of the industrial growth system. It's beginning to happen, but I just want to urge the listeners to look into this more, because I would say it's the most empowering, the most uplifting, the most hopeful thing we can do.
I think definitely this is something that I've taken quite a few days now to look into since reading the book. And it wasn't just the book Ancient Futures that you wrote, and you also obviously made this award-winning documentary about your learnings in Ladakh called The Economics of Happiness, the principles of which you lay out through a narrative in a way that still strikes a serious chord now, almost 30 years since you created it, because I guess the problems you address, or the many issues we faced then, and the Ladakhi community experience directly as things have changed in their lives with the influx of roads, importation of Western life that you mentioned, our products arriving in droves, and they're being exposed to visions of our lifestyle here. They're more sort of like on an epidemic level now. So how do you think globalization is actually affecting us right now?
Right now, globalization, which again, let's remember, globalization means the continual deregulation of global finance and trade. So what we're talking about is a process whereby global banks and corporations are getting more and more freedom. The free trade is about their freedom to move around the globe without any restrictions, use the cheapest labor, the cheapest resources, and they are essentially pressuring governments to give them the freedom to do as they please. That includes, free trade zones and so on, where they can do exactly as they like. It also includes clauses in these trade treaties where governments are signing in black and white, we will not do anything that might reduce your profit-making potential. So that means things like a Swedish nuclear power company suing Germany when Germany decided to phase out nuclear power after Fukushima. It means things like tobacco companies suing countries because they want to advertise that tobacco might be harmful to your health. It means companies suing Canada because they want to ban a toxic chemical. It's a disaster. And yet the logic of global trade being the engine of growth means that economists who are so far removed from life support this. Their argument is, well, of course, these companies are making huge investments and they have to be, assured that government is not going to get in the way and prevent them from recouping their investments. For me, it's the blindness at the top as well as the grassroots that's allowing this system to escalate and to continue. And I think the biggest problem is that those who have studied globalization have been doing that at universities and in a world where big money has been funding the textbooks, has been funding the institutes at universities. I myself was connected to interdisciplinary departments at several universities. I taught at one at the University of Berkeley, which, because of the environmental movement as it started, Rachel Carson was a very important voice in raising awareness about the need to move beyond narrow specialized science, saying, we think we can create this pesticide and just, sprinkle it over here in a corner of the globe and we'll kill some insects we don't like. But actually, look what's happening. DDT is spreading through ecosystems, moving across the world. It's extremely dangerous. We need broader, more holistic, interdisciplinary science. That was a strong message from the environmental movement, and there were some changes made in universities to accommodate the wisdom of that more holistic approach. But as big business became aware of these issues, they got involved, and I actually knew some of the key players who did that, like Maurice Strong, who organized this huge meeting of environmentalists in Rio in 92. Now, he was doing this out of essentially good intentions. He was concerned about the environment, and he wanted to get his friends who were CEOs in the corporate world to take this seriously. And so they started organizing these giant environmental meetings. But the problem is that as leaders of giant global corporations, the last thing they were going to look at was their own shadow. And so this process of big business getting involved has actually set the movement back immensely over the last 30 years. And what's happened is that science has been funded more and more by big business. We've seen biology transformed on many campuses to be essentially genetic engineering laboratories. and field biology virtually dying. We've seen huge changes in medicine as the pharmaceutical industry has been more and more involved in funding the science and the research. And in the meanwhile, many doctors believe that acupuncture is sort of witchcraft, and herbs haven't been proven to be efficacious because they haven't been tested properly. And all these amazing holistic doctors and naturopaths around the world who've had huge success with more natural preventative medicine have not had the resources to do studies, costing millions, if not billions of dollars. They are just in practice proving that these things can work and have worked. I mean, acupuncture, Chinese medicine has been around for 10,000 years. So it's really, I think the predicament is this combination of a narrow and ever more narrow specialized view linked to larger and larger scale economic enterprise. And that's what is creating a situation today where we're in such terrible chaos and we see so much breakdown, spiritual, social, ecological, democracy failing. And when you put on these lenses of looking at the benefits of localizing instead of continuing to globalize, it's very heartening. I see not only people feeling empowered and inspired, but getting on at the grassroots with the process of localizing. And that itself is so deeply healing, both spiritually and materially, that all I can do is try to urge people to look more closely at this movement.
We've had quite a long look through the course of this podcast at ecofeminist Vandana Shiva, who's appeared on your film. She's been in your book. She's obviously someone you admire and respect and have an amazing friendship with and professional relationship with. But I think she's kind of spoken of this idea in one of your talks recently about lockdown and the lockdown effect on local businesses, and of course these big tech companies getting richer and bigger and more powerful. And I think that it'd be interesting to sort of hear what your thoughts are on why this kind of idea of localization perhaps has never been more important, because I guess of the effect that whole situation in the last 12 months has actually had on the global economy.
Yeah, I think, the truth is that after COVID, the world is moving in two opposing directions. And I already wrote in my book, Ancient Futures, about this, that already then I was observing that from the top down, our political and economic leaders, and I'm talking again now about the global corporate leadership and our national governments and how they've been working together. And unfortunately, they were continuing to push in this direction of more specialized knowledge, more and more competitive, fast, large, and essentially linked to a sort of military race to get to Mars first, to mine more minerals there, continuing to trash the earth and blindly following this outdated dogma about what constitutes growth. And I've met with Nobel Prize winning economists and so on, and I realized that they are so out of touch that they believe that they're doing what's necessary. Just like many of them believe that we need ever bigger monocultures to feed the world, even though those monocultures kill the soil, destroy the biodiversity, are vastly less productive than smaller diversified farms. So this ecological illiteracy, it's very scary. And we already had this divergence that from the top down, they were continuing with this mechanistic, fundamentalist dogma about growth. And on the other hand, all around the world, you could see at the grassroots, people waking up, wanting to establish a better relationship with nature. Everywhere you looked, you could see people coming up with eco-literacy, eco-psychology, eco-theology, ecological architecture, ecological agriculture, ecological fibers. Every discipline, every activity was starting to get that eco or alternative label, alternative healthcare, etc. And you could see also that around the world, the leadership there was female. It was women, it was human scale, it was always less visible and had almost no support from government, no support from the mainstream media. But still, it was happening from the bottom up. So this is something that I saw and identified already in the 90s. And it's continued. But now after COVID, in a way, both sides have gained strength. But what is scary is that the money and the financial casino, as we can see, has gained a lot more wealth and, in a sense, power through those trillions of dollars that are being accumulated in the hands of fewer and fewer corporations, the gap between rich and poor widening in every country. But we must remember that on the other side, the people, and we are talking about more than 99% of the human race, the people, not all, but on a very, very significant scale, people have been waking up to the joy and benefit of more extended family and community relationships, to growing food and the importance of local food. There's been this wonderful news. It doesn't get out in the mainstream, but when you talk to people, you're in touch, as we are, working in many different countries, you hear of, how seedlings would sell out, or people wanted to buy chickens to start having chickens at home. Even the tools for gardening was hard to get a hold of. Bicycles and bicycle shops were finding, 3 times as much business. And so in a very clear way, particularly the appreciation of community and local food grew, and a skepticism about dependence on the global economy also grew. When there was news that we couldn't even produce our own masks in different countries, it led to people starting to think about the vulnerability in the global economy. When there was suddenly a problem of not being able to import migrants, poor migrants, to pick the vegetables, and there were food shortages in the supermarkets, again, awareness grew. So I would argue the real power is with the people, is with nature, but we are in a situation where we've got to do everything we can to just shout from the rooftops that smaller scale, more diversified, more community-based ways of doing things work better, are more efficient, heal nature, heal people, and we have just got to do everything we can to start and support those initiatives that, broadly speaking, are about localizing, while practicing what I call big picture activism, raising awareness about that bigger picture of what our governments are doing when they keep supporting the globalizing path, what they're doing when they keep supporting high tech in order to support that globalizing path, what they're thinking when they advocate for 100% urbanization, when they use the FAO to promote in Africa agriculture where robots are doing the work on the land, linked to drones, linked to satellites to measure carbon. This is all coming out of a blind, outdated, fundamentalist dogma that is killing the planet. And yet where I differ with Vandana is that I'm not sure that someone like Bill Gates has to recognize how destructive it is what he's doing. I think he's happily earning plenty of money, and he's happily wedded to a worldview where dollars hidden behind technology create a framing and a worldview where he does not have to understand life itself. He has no understanding of health, either mental or physical. but he's not necessarily, a mastermind behind some kind of conspiracy to destroy the world. He's just happily earning lots of money, and tragically, we don't have enough voices from the grassroots that have clarity about the issues to represent a strong voice for an alternative.
I think it was interesting to read an article about Bill Gates that you mentioned there, that he has like this underground vault that has like a copy of all the different seeds that have ever kind of existed in the world. I'm not quite sure. I mean, obviously one can speculate as to the reasons why he might have done that, but it's kind of like quite unbelievable when obviously our seed sovereignty is a real issue for global food makers around the world. And there's obviously a theme that Vandana Shiva has also explored in some of her books and we've talked about on this podcast, but it's quite inconceivable that he's kind of in that position where that's even become a thing.
Yeah, well, that actually there is one of the biggest seed banks in the world is in Norway, and there have been quite reputable environmentalists in favor of storing seeds in this way, concerned about the loss of biodiversity. So there have even been people with the best of intentions supporting that. So it's not quite, again, the way it can be painted. Nevertheless, everyone who's really in touch with the living world, who has grown food, who's in touch with this living diversity of ever-changing, moment-to-moment living cells in leaves, in our bodies, in every earthworm, every gust of wind, that uniqueness of every moment and that diversity means that people recognize there's no way you're going to put these seeds in some cement vault and keep them alive. It's not going to work. It has to be a continual process of planting and keeping that live heritage of seed conservation through the ages, as it always has been, until we allowed corporate fossil fuel-based ways of transforming agriculture, particularly after the Second World War. It's widely recognized now that what came in was chemicals from the war machine, from the bombs. And it's remarkable that people can be supportive of that industrial form of agriculture when it used these toxic chemicals to supposedly, to kill off the unpleasant pests, to use chemical fertilizers and created dust bowls. We knew that created dust bowls already generations ago, and still we've continued in the same direction, always with this idea, we've got to feed the world, we've got to feed the world. And with more and more people in the cities who don't have any experience on the ground, and particularly people who've never experienced really healthy farms, healthy farming communities, it's understandable that they get misled into these assumptions.
It's just mind-boggling, to be honest with you. And the more I've kind of, had a look at your, the text that you have produced, it is a fascinating topic. And it's one that I would actually have to say before starting this podcast, I didn't understand the full kind of, ramifications of the fact, for example, on Ibiza, that only 2% of the food that's made here is actually consumed here. And I really just couldn't wrap my head around, what this could possibly be about, and why, as you've talked about as well recently, I saw a clip on Instagram where you were talking about on the Local Futures page that, we all have a right to eat sort of affordable, local, healthy, fresh food. But unfortunately, that food is actually often more expensive, as you've said before, about, more expensive than what we do find in the local supermarket that's come from, tens of thousands of miles away. And I think that's a really interesting subject to explore. I think a lot of people don't really think about that, or don't really understand the reasons why a lot of countries are importing and exporting the same amount of similar products, and why the prices are cheaper for things that have traveled from such a long way away. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and why that actually comes to be?
Yeah, thank you. I do think I just want to say again clearly that for anyone who's interested in pursuing this argument about local and global, the best area to look is food and farming. That's where things really become clear. And let's also keep in mind when we do that, that food is the only thing human beings produce that every single human being needs every day of their life. And usually about 3 times a day we need to eat. And that activity of producing food, selling it, processing it, etc., that activity has been marginalized and relegated to a subset of the important business. So our governments have ended up concerned with banking and industrial production of other goods, and the farmers have been pushed to essentially produce like a factory. They're being pressured to produce apples and potatoes that are identical in size, that fit the machinery, and then the washing machinery and the harvesting machinery and the supermarket shelves and the packaging that goes with that. So that already, that industrial machine-like production has been a disaster.
Once upon a time in Ibiza with Joanna Ruby.
Come with me, up the rocky track that weaves along the fringe of the forest near Santa Ynez, a track that I've only ever walked by night. Come with me now, at dusk, and as we climb higher, the sky falls around us like a dark cloth. Let's follow this path that someone once showed me. Soon we reach a metal barrier, and from then onwards we are somewhere between here and there. Night travellers of the pines, knowing no more than what our little torchlight illuminates. Soon it will hit you suddenly, our exit from the forest. Like lightning now we shoot higher to the plateau on the hill. If you looked upwards now you would see the sky ablaze with stars, but you won't, not yet. We're passing the farmhouse to our right, but I didn't prepare you, so it came unexpected. You stand fixed on the spot as I was, staring at a haunted sandstone house with black mouths for windows. But I won't wait for you. You follow. Meet me on the threshing floor beyond. You'll find it because there's nowhere else to go from here without tumbling forwards into the Bay of San Antonio. So meet me there on the threshing circle. Lie down on the stony ground as the Perseids pass over. Empty amphitheatre of the starry sky, where a farmer's cattle once trod the grain. Could we be any richer than we are now, you and I? They say the farmer's house still lies empty because with all the sacks of gold that they could offer, he said no. He said no. He said no. Can you smell that waft of rosemary and pine, dear friend? And how is it that the ground beneath my feet still feels so warm on this August night? Oh, look, a shooting star. I dedicate that one to the man who said no.
Where we see it most clearly is with animal factories, which have become the most cruel, the most toxic, the most obscene way of doing things. And unfortunately, what's happening now is that there's been well-funded propaganda to tell people that the only way to solve this is to become vegan. And this is a very unfortunate message because actually what we need to feed the world is highly diversified farming and some animals in the cycle, animals that eat waste, that never compete with human consumption, that will eat the acorns, that will eat the parts of the vegetables that we don't eat, that will graze on land where we can't farm. That has been part of farming forever. And we need to be supporting that diversification, even if it just means that you have ducks in the rice paddies, as they often do in Japan and Korea, eating the weeds. But what you're doing with that diversification, including animals, is dramatically increasing the productivity. But this diversified, more traditional way of farming coexists with more localized markets. It's when the huge industrial farming came in, it came in as part of this trading system. And so these vast monocultures were being produced for export because that was the formula in the economy that governments were following. And that has meant that we have a structural connection between countries abandoning their food sovereignty, abandoning the ability to feed themselves, and instead importing and exporting the same food product. So in the US now, they export about 1 billion tons of beef, and they turn around and import 1 billion tons of beef. Actually, more recently now, it's gone up to about 1.5 billion tons. UK exports as much milk and butter as it imports. You have oranges from California in Australia selling for half the price of Australian oranges that are ripe, at that time. It's just insane. Why? Because if all around the world, regions and countries fed themselves, so imagine that our basic foodstuff to feed ourselves with a diverse, healthy diet came from the region or our country, no multinational would make money, but instead billions of farmers, billions of smaller shops and middlemen and so on would be making money. So we're in this tragic situation because we've allowed global players to dominate so much, and we've deregulated them while over-regulating local, regional, and national activity. Now, to change this, to say, let's, very quickly look at climate change, the packaging, what it costs to import and export food. Let's look at the truth that because of the logic of global corporate freedom, they are forced to go around looking for the cheapest labor. That means they literally fly fish from Norway, from England, from America to China to be deboned, flown back again. Apples flown across the world to be washed, flown back again. Shrimp from England, peeled in Thailand, flown back again. This insanity is going on while we talk about climate change, and no mention of this. Instead, what we've been hearing is you greedy human nature, you terrible people, why are you not listening to this message about climate change? We are like a cancer on the earth. Hopefully the robots will do a better job. That's now a dominant narrative. Instead of saying, wait a minute, what happened? Why did we not hear about this insane trade in food and this flying things back and forth to be processed? Not only food, water, plastic waste has been imported and exported. Toxic chemicals exported and imported. Prisoners imported and exported. It's really, truly insane. And if we were to look, particularly remembering the food economy, people need to eat every single day, usually about 3 times a day, to have government policies that ensure that your food comes from further and further away. From all our analysis, we would argue that making changes to the food system towards localized food systems is the single most important thing we can do for climate change, reducing plastic, and restoring health to ecosystems and to our bodies. I mean, a lot more to say. It goes on and on because we're only learning all the time about all kinds of ways that local knowledge with local heirloom species of animals, of trees, of vegetables, of fruit, those localized systems are what people love now to use the word resilient. They are the ones that have been adapted to specific climates and specific ecosystems. In an era of climate change, also, there is the need for experimentation and for increasing diversity even further. And on a crowded planet, we need to immediately shift towards smaller scale diversified farming to feed people without destroying the planet. But instead, what our governments are doing is pursuing a policy of 100% urbanization into megacities that are now described as smart, green, new cities. But they are absolute disaster. They're making use of scarce minerals, mining countries. I mean, we know already what's happened to Congo. It's linked to the mobile phone computer industry, where every year we're being encouraged to upgrade and throw away, billions of tons of toxic electronic waste. It's all linked to this obscene obsolescence, built-in obsolescence, which is obscene. And so we must wake up to the fundamental contradiction between food and farming and its needs and the economic system. And this is something that I really hope that women will be willing to do. What I see is the leadership among women around the world is to actually pioneer and start and lead many of these local food initiatives, whether they're starting farmers markets, whether they're starting to grow food, whether they help to start an edible schoolyard at their school, whether they help to start a new project where the homeless can actually learn to grow some of their own food, whether they start community gardens. But what we also need is a clear message about how the dominant economic path that our governments are pursuing has to change. Because all the time what that does is to make labor too expensive, energy and technology too cheap, and that imported food from the other side of the world artificially cheap. It's not efficiency, it's a false, fake economy because of the hidden supports for that energy-intensive, wasteful, and toxic way of doing things.
Very interesting what you've said there in terms of, the number one thing that's just not talked about right now when we talk about climate change is this exact idea that things are being shipped around and crisscrossing the planet before they reach their final destination for us to actually buy. I think a lot of people, when we talk about climate change, they feel a little bit helpless. I think there's kind of, people feeling a little bit depressed about the fact that they don't really know what it is that they specifically can do, because of course we're told we can all do something. But I think a lot of people just have no idea where to begin. And it is, probably one of the most simple and easy things to solve, actually, after what you just explained and what I've been reading in your books. And, that is our food source. It's probably one of the primary places that we can commence this journey of making that change and shopping locally, supporting our local producers and suppliers. And I love the fact that there's obviously a real shift, I think, governmentally at the moment. There's a lot more women coming into power globally, which is kind of a fascinating and wonderful thing to witness, because I do feel like it's kind of like a bit of an ecofeminist issue. And there is a lot of amazing women doing a lot of amazing work. And it's also interesting to note that, a lot of the food producers, a lot of the farmers, a lot of the people, looking after our seed sovereignty are women who are kind of, putting these kind of mechanisms in place to protect our food supply, but also continue to keep that ball rolling so that we can support local and keep that story or depressing angle of, everything being flown around and imported to an absolute minimum. I think there was 16.9 million people, I was reading an article yesterday, that were actually visiting Ibiza in 2019, which is a frightening statistic, actually. I couldn't quite believe an island as small as this could even manage to feed and house, that many tourists in 1 year. But of course, they've got to eat. And clearly, if you could just imagine that we could make enough food, here and regenerate the soil and correct the kind of places that we've been going wrong in terms of the monocultures that we've been creating as well. I think, it can have a very, very positive picture here, which, I don't know, did you get that impression when you were here?
Well, I certainly got the impression that there were many people who were very interested in this, and it's grown a lot during COVID. So I'm really thrilled about that growth and interest in Ibiza. But I also want to say that, I often make the point, again, coming from Ladakh and Bhutan, where I also worked over several years, that the modern economy has marginalized the two most important things that we do as human beings. And one of them is mothering, and the other one is producing food. And so this combination of women taking the lead and doing it through their nurturing, feminine, instinctive behavior is vital. And there I want to urge women to also be aware that one of the ways this system has cut us off often from our more feminine nurturing instinct has been to isolate us and to push us into this little nuclear family, which just doesn't work. And it doesn't work because what's happening is that the infant, the small child that has an absolutely infinite need for care and connection, one mother simply can't answer all those needs. So an absolute key in learning from indigenous culture and in learning about the benefits of localization is to do everything we can to connect with one another, to connect in small groups. So we change the I to a we. So when we're asking, what can we do about climate change? We've already broadened the picture into, can we maybe as a small group of women start an initiative that is more than just individually trying to shop locally, but can we actually further the movement, partly by raising awareness, building up much more support for the local growers. The growers, just like mothers, are struggling in this impossible situation where they've been marginalized. And in both cases, with mothering and farming, there's far too little labor. Labor meaning we need more people to do each task, for caring for the children, come together, share the caring, find ways of really supporting one another so that there can be more, essentially more arms to carry every infant, to care for every child, even by doing things like deciding to just on a private basis, creating childcare so that you share that caring among a group of families. Ideally, even think of starting homeschooling initiatives rather than putting them into the factory farm, which is what the school is. The school has been part of the problem from the beginning. It's been linked to this industrial production of people, of animals, of plants. So caring for that more human scale, individual, and community-based way of doing things. So what I'm seeing is that one of the most tragic things that's happened to us is that we've been so cut off from one another that we live behind this facade that in our little nuclear family, everything is perfect. And we're living up to those Hollywood role models of what we should be, perfectly beautiful, perfectly efficient, perfectly successful. What happens when people come together to really connect is that the key is the open-hearted sharing of our problems, of our vulnerabilities, of that deep recognition that no one is perfect. So we haven't seen how in the modern era, the screen, previously through television and films, that was beamed in on people. And by the way, I saw this dramatically, in places like Mongolia, and Ladakh, and Bhutan, and Thailand, where in remote villages, suddenly you get these images of always urban, clean, glamorous people. And this is who you're supposed to be. Now the social media is leading to young people doing this to each other, sending photos of themselves at a party, and then the others feel left out. We've really got to watch out for the screen that separates us and come together face to face. And I know it's difficult now with COVID in some places, but I guess my biggest plea to any women listening to this, I'm assuming it's mostly women, is that they think of that way of coming together in small groups to share, the open-hearted, vulnerable, real self, who they are, and at the same time look at how they can jointly take initiatives, and get the big picture out. I'm so glad you're doing a podcast. I hope it gets out widely. It's a really important way of getting the word out.
Well, I'm so glad that you could spare a little bit of time to join us today. I mean, we just want to talk about, before we have to let you go, the World Globalisation Day. I mean, obviously you had the inaugural event last year. You had some massive names, really amazing people talking, and really interesting, perspectives and information in that incredibly long and brilliant video that's on the website. I absolutely loved watching that a couple of days ago. And I think obviously you're going to be back again this June for another innings over the summer solstice weekend. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've got lined up for that and what you're kind of hoping to achieve this year with that?
Yes, well, the whole idea behind launching World Localisation Day is to make visible that counter trend from the bottom up, the community building, the connection to nature, the reconnection among people. So that's what the localization movement represents, and we want to make it more visible. Last year we did this program, and as you said, I got Noam Chomsky and Russell Brand and Jane Goodall, Brian Eno, Eve Ensler, of course, Vandana Shiva. Anyway, a lot of people who have a lot of value to say. And this year, the main thing we're doing is working with our networks, our collaborators in about 15 countries, from Japan, Korea to Mexico, Brazil, and across the world. They will be putting on events in their own languages. And because of COVID, they will be online events. And they will be, wherever possible, also doing face-to-face outdoor events to celebrate and make visible the localization movement in their countries and regions. They will be they'll be doing that from mid-May until June 20th. This year, the sort of day that we're going to be having an event that goes around the world will be on the 20th because it's Sunday. But so they'll be reporting from their various countries on that day. And we're also, as a central part of this, we're encouraging people to organize local food feasts. And the local food feast will be a sort of central theme. And we'll be having, in all those countries, there'll be things going on. We'll also be offering people who want to sign up for a local food feast that will be facilitated by a local futures person to discuss the issue of why local food is so important, what they can do, and joining us for a meal, in different countries, cooking a meal that is, 80% local ingredients, hopefully, and then sharing and discussing in a sort of facilitated conversation. We'll have that. We're also hoping, we'll be asking some of our friends and colleagues to organize a local food feast and do a little self-video of that, and we'll put together footage from that to show this incredible array of what's going on around the world. And we will also be involving some of our better-known figures in these various programs, which will include webinars, in other words, discussions on these themes in the week before the 20th. But things will start happening from about mid-May. So there's going to be a lot more going on and much more spread around the world. And then for the week leading up, there'll be international webinars and there'll be an international program on the day. And the local food feast will feature in all of that as one of the activities that, anyone who wanted to organize it. Hopefully there will be some in Ibiza. One of the things that will happen, for instance, in Byron, is that we'll close down a whole street. We'll have a table, about a kilometer long or something, with people outdoors eating a local food feast and, also paying attention to the farmers who grew the food, and with lots of music and celebrating the joy of that healthier economy and that community get together.
Helena, that sounds absolutely amazing, and I'm hoping that we can obviously, join that lovely movement and support you in that World Localisation Day in June. Lastly, can we just, we've talked about a lot of sort of globalised problems, I suppose, and things that are destroying our planet. But I'd just love to finish on a sort of a kind of a note of like real hope, because you were saying in your book that, you get these emails every day about these amazing communities and initiatives already starting up all over the globe. And it's like, this work and this waking up, if you like, is kind of already starting to happen. It's not all doom and gloom. There does seem to be a real work happening now to kind of break away from this kind of globalized economy and move more towards the new one.
Absolutely. And again, it's definitely led by women. And it's definitely the case that whether in the old local, in other words, more indigenous ways of living, traditional ones, and especially in the new local, with people often having traveled the world, often having tasted that career path in the big city, have discovered what really gives life meaning. So what I find is I'm in touch with the most inspiring people, because they're always the happiest, healthiest people. The sort of every single day I'm in touch with these, just amazing people, full of energy, healthier, happier. And it's sometimes, I think, well, a lot of women have said to me, you put words to what I always felt, but I couldn't articulate so clearly. So I think one of the things about all of this is articulating more clearly why the dominant path is so empty, and so why it creates so much anxiety and depression, how it is that the stars in that system end up drug addicted and unhappy. Russell Brand is a good storyteller about all of that, what he experienced. And so I think, as people discover, if you like, the inner life, what is it that makes us happy? They're talking about a sort of spiritual awakening of realizing that it is through connection to others and to the living world that we start recovering our humanity. And so, yes, I feel I do get in my inbox every day, I do get more good news than I get bad news. But then I'm not reading the mainstream media so much either. So there's definitely both going on. There's no denying that we have, that we need to encourage this two-pronged approach where people start taking action through reconnection at the local level, but also spread the word through what I'm calling big picture activism.
Helena, thank you so much. I know that you've got to dash, and I really, really appreciate you making the time for sharing all of that with us today. And I wish you all the best with your World Localisation Day in Byron Bay.
Thank you so much. Loved being here with you, and maybe we can do something before June again. I'd love to.
Sure.
I'd love to stay in touch. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Have a gorgeous day.
Bye.
Bye.
Tastier, healthier, happier. The future is local. Co-creating a better world is easier than you think, and it starts with grocery shopping. This month, focus on Ecophacious. Ecophacious was established on the initiative of 14 small organic farmers in Ibiza. Their objective is to improve the availability and accessibility to local organic produce. Organic vegetable boxes with produce from member farms are available weekly with prices starting from €10 per box. You'll find the store at Carrer de Sa Blancadona 24, Blancadona. Tastier, healthier, happier. Discover Ecophacious. Make the future happen.
It was the Ibiza podcast of Gang of Witches, hosted by Jo Youle. See you at the next new moon. Until then, take care of yourselves.